carbon dioxide is made as a waste product by cells, and blood helps to transport that carbon dioxide from the tissues to the lungs, where we can breathe it out. Now, to facilitate this, blood has three important mechanisms to move carbon dioxide around. First, a small amount of carbon dioxide is dissolved in the plasma, which is the liquid portion of blood. Now, to calculate the concentration of dissolved carbon dioxide, you can multiply the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, or PCO2, measured in millimeters of mercury, with the solubility of carbon dioxide. The solubility of carbon dioxide is the amount of carbon dioxide that can be dissolved in the blood. And it turns out that in 100 milliliters of blood, 0.07 milliliters of carbon dioxide is dissolved per millimeter of mercury of carbon dioxide. In venous blood, the equation becomes dissolved carbon dioxide equals the venous partial pressure of carbon dioxide, or PvCO2, in millimeters of mercury times 0.07 milliliters of carbon dioxide per millimeter of mercury per 100 milliliters of blood. And if we plug in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the veins, which is about 45 millimeters of mercury, we get 3.15 milliliters of carbon dioxide in 100 milliliters of blood. This works out to be about 5% of the total carbon dioxide transported by the blood. Now, another 3%, or about 1.89 milliliters of carbon dioxide in 100 milliliters of blood, is transported a second way. Carbon dioxide binds directly to the terminal amino acids of each of the 4 globin chains in a hemoglobin protein. Hemoglobin is the most abundant protein in the red blood cells, and each hemoglobin can hold up to 4 molecules of carbon dioxide. When hemoglobin is bound to carbon dioxide, it's called carbaminohemoglobin. Now, carbaminohemoglobin has a slightly different shape than hemoglobin, and it has less affinity for oxygen, and this is called the Bohr effect. This leads to slightly more oxygen becoming unbound and getting dropped off in tissues full of carbon dioxide, and this causes a shift to the right in the oxygen-hemoglobin dissociation curve. But the majority of carbon dioxide, about 90%, or about 56.7 milliliters of carbon dioxide in 100 milliliters of blood, is transported a third way, which involves turning carbon dioxide into a bicarbonate ion, or HCO3-. To get there, carbon dioxide first undergoes a chemical reaction with water to form carbonic acid, or H2CO3. As a weak acid, carbonic acid easily dissociates into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. And these reactions are reversible, and can happen in the opposite direction as well. And while this reaction can also happen in the plasma, it's sped up in the red blood cell by the enzyme carbonic anhydrase to produce a large amount of HCO3- and H+. As bicarbonate ion levels build up in the red blood cell, the bicarbonate ions start moving down their concentration gradient and flow into the plasma. The shift in charge this creates is balanced by facilitated diffusion, an ionic exchange between bicarbonate and chloride, called the chloride shift. So chloride comes into the red blood cell as bicarbonate goes into the plasma. And here bicarbonate plays an important role in maintaining physiologic hydrogen ion levels in the blood, which ultimately affects pH levels. It does this through Le Chatelier's principle. In other words, when the hydrogen ion concentration gets low, the equation moves to the right, producing more bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. Conversely, when there are lots of hydrogen ions around, the bicarbonate will bind to a hydrogen ion and form carbonic acid, which then slips into water and carbon dioxide. Ultimately, the concentration of hydrogen ions doesn't shift too quickly in either direction, and that means that the pH stays stable. Now, carbon dioxide waste ultimately needs to make its way from the tissues to the lungs and be removed from the body through expiration. So in the lungs, release of carbon dioxide from the blood happens because of a decrease in partial pressure of carbon dioxide and an increase of partial pressure of oxygen compared to the tissues. This means that all of the processes working to pick up carbon dioxide in the tissues are reversed in the lungs. As a result of higher partial pressure of oxygen, more oxygen diffuses into the red blood cells and binds with hemoglobin at its heme group. Now, even though oxygen doesn't compete with carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions for binding sites, it does alter hemoglobin's shape just slightly, and this reduces hemoglobin's binding affinity for carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions. This is called the Haldane effect. And it means that as more oxygen binds to hemoglobin, more carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions become unbound. Now, when there's a rise in hydrogen ions, more bicarbonate is needed to bind with it, so bicarbonate re-enters the red blood cell from the plasma, once again by flowing down its concentration gradient, except this time it's going into the red blood cell. With all this extra carbon dioxide building up, partial pressure of carbon dioxide increases and drives carbon dioxide diffusion down its partial pressure gradient from the red blood cell into the plasma. And from there it goes into the alveoli, where partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 40 millimeters of mercury. Partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the alveoli and blood equilibrate about 20 times faster than oxygen. And this is largely because carbon dioxide is about 23 times more soluble than oxygen. This is super important because even when there's a buildup of fluid in the lungs, like in pulmonary edema, and it's tough for oxygen to diffuse into the blood, carbon dioxide can still easily diffuse out of the blood. Alright, as a quick recap, there are 3 ways for carbon dioxide to move around in the blood: dissolved directly into the blood plasma, bound to hemoglobin as carbaminohemoglobin, and chemically modified and dissolved in the plasma as bicarbonate ions. These processes of carbon dioxide being picked up in the tissues are all reversible in the lungs, and this leads to carbon dioxide expiration.